Peace and Anarchy, Episode 4.
Could it all be a bad dream or a nightmare? Is it my imagination, or have we lost our minds?
If you got a business, that you didn't build that. Somebody else made that happen.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
Violence and lost liberty will result without some revolutionary thinking. We must escape from the madness of crowds now gathering.
All right, welcome to Episode 4 of Peace and Anarchy. I want to thank our audience for listening to our 3-episode bonanza last week for our premiere. It was a lot of work, but a lot of fun, and I hope we continue to grow an audience. And I have gotten the podcast. We're now officially on iTunes and
celebrate.
Stitcher. Go to our website, and you'll see links everywhere to these two.
And of course, we have SoundCloud soon to come. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Tabor. And
Let's
you
do
want
it.
to get started? So, have you seen the meme that's been going around lately about government water versus private sector water?
Yeah, I hear the town of Flint, Michigan is poisoning its citizenry. You want to tell us about what's been going on there?
Yeah, so the town of Flint, it's pretty much government in a nutshell. So the town of Flint, it's a suburb of Detroit in Michigan. And most of the people that work there, they work for the auto industry, which was completely decimated, as you know, by the 2008 crash. Right? The GM and Chrysler were the two that got bailed out because, you know, too big to fail.
So an already hurting area.
Right. So they can't tax their citizens anymore because they have no money to give the government. And it turns out during the good years, Flint had agreed to pay government pensions that were absurdly high. Like, absurdly high, like Bell, California levels. And for those that don't know, Bell, California was the town that made news quite a few years ago for having pensions on the order of $800,000 a year for former government employees. Jeez. So Flint, turns out, is in the same boat. And they had several emergency managers that were put in place by the state-level government in order to sort this out and try to fix this financial
like the czar
problem.
system on a local level.
And exactly. And so the way that these emergency managers decided to solve the problem was to reduce the cost of water for the water delivery in their town. And so normally Flint gets its water from Detroit in the Detroit water system. Well, that was getting to be too expensive because they had to keep paying these pensions. And so they had to come up with another plan. So they agreed to join a regional water authority that was working on a new pipeline to get water from the Great Lakes, which is a freshwater source. But that was 3 years away from completion. This agreement happened back in 2013.
All right, so as of 2013, there's an agreement to source new fresh water from the lakes. But that's going to be delayed for 3 years, so
Correct.
There's this sort of interim period.
Right, but that can't happen.
Okay.
Right. And then the Detroit water system sent a notice of termination to Flint saying, great, we'll end your services in a year. So we've got a bit of a time mismatch.
Yeah, just go without water for a few years.
And right, you don't need water for 2 years. You don't need it in 2014 and 2015, right? Well, obviously, that's not quite going to work, and so Detroit ended the contract. Flint needs to find a way to get water to its citizens because the government is in charge of piping water.
Right, no
to
private
everyone's
producers
house.
of home-supplied water.
Correct. And so as a stopgap measure, they decided to use the Flint River. Now, using the Flint River is akin to using the Hudson River in New York.
Pretty bad.
You don't want to do it. The water is highly corrosive, so shortly after they flipped the switch and started using the Flint the Flint River, the water tested positive for E. coli. So the local government started tossing in disinfectants.
I see.
The water.
As of June 12, city officials were already treating water with lime in response to complaints. Yet the mayor is on record saying, "I think people are wasting their precious money buying bottled water." That's of June 12 in 2014, and then on August 15th, just a couple months later, a boil advisory for part of the city is issued for after water tests came back positive for E. coli. So as of August of 2014, the city government of Flint is recommending that people boil their water as if this is the 1800s.
Right. It's already not safe to drink, and it just gets worse from there. So all the lime and disinfectants that they threw into the river to treat the water, well, the pipe system that they were using was made of lead. So when you have a corrosive
we
water
laugh,
system,
but it's not funny.
corrosive water going through. Well, we're laughing at the government incompetence. Clearly, this is not a funny situation. So, corrosive water going through lead pipes is obviously going to lead to a lot of lead leaching into the drinking water, which is exactly what happened. The government acceptable limit for lead is 15 parts per billion, and in some homes in Flint, it was detected at 397
this is
parts
vastly
per
more.
billion. Vastly over 20 times more, which is insane. And so the Flint, as a response, Flint, the city council voted to return, "Hey, Detroit, we will go back onto the Detroit
as of
water."
January 13 in 2015, so just about a year ago now, protesters rally outside City Hall to demand a return to Detroit's supply and lower water bills.
Well, the issue with that is that the pipe system has already been corroded, so it does not matter where the water source is now.
So the pipes are already ruined.
Because the pipes are what is leaching the lead into the water. So originally the E. coli was a problem, and then when you add the corrosive water on top of that, you can get rid of the E. coli problem, but they have to entirely replace the piping system in order to remove the lead problem. And on top of all of this, Flint is still in state receivership because of the whole pension problem. And what they've been doing now to appease the citizenship from rioting is that they've been handing out bottled water to everybody.
Despite the fact that here, as of April 2, we have the mayor again saying in a tweet, quote, "My family and I drink and use the Flint water every day at home, work, and schools." Well, good for you, bro. You take that corroded, poisonous, lead-based water. Yeah.
Right, and so I think with the new switch, so they have officially switched to the regional water authority at this point. I think that they're no longer drawing water from the Flint River, but they're still getting far above the allowable lead limit. Which it's kind of absurd that there is such a lead limit in the first place. I can't imagine the free market would allow that to happen.
Just accept a little bit of lead, a little mercury
here
and there.
Right, you have a government water system, which has led to nothing but disaster. Right, we have a drought situation in California. Why? Because we don't have a free market price for water, so there's no incentive for conservation. And now you have in Michigan leaded water being piped directly to your faucet.
Wow. This really has...
It turns out that the decision way back when was actually approved by the EPA, so you can't even say that it worked on a federal level.
And there really is...
Local, state, and federal.
Right. All levels of government have come together. And it's really... There is no solution. As of 2016, the newest mayor, Karen Weaver, who, of course, ran on resolving the water crisis. She was elected over Mayor Walling, who was the previous mayor up until 2015. As of 2016, the new mayor had called a state of emergency. The Department of Justice, as of January 5th, has opened an investigation. The National Guard is distributing water.
Right, the National Guard is distributing water.
Instances of Legionnaire's disease, up to 10 deaths from this. The Michigan Attorney General has opened an investigation. The president has signed an emergency declaration.
It's a federal
Really
state of
incredible.
emergency.
I mean,
so now we have $5 million in federal funds just to buy bottled water to distribute to all the residents. And of course, buying bottled water doesn't address the problem that the city has ruined the entire plumbing system.
Of course, the answer here would be...
Which the plumbing system, by the way, for the individual houses would have been private. For your house, you're in charge of your own plumbing system.
I see.
But because of the lead situation, they've now ruined individuals' homes' plumbing.
Sounds like privatization is immediately needed.
Right. And of course, if a private water company had pulled some nonsense like what the failures of government have happened, they would have been fired immediately, and they would have been financially responsible for the damage that's been done. Because I don't think that the estimates at $5 billion or $28 million really cover what's going on, because you're going to have a situation like the PG&E the Aaron Brockovich situation in Southern California, where PG&E was poisoning the water supply.
PG&E being the utility for that area.
And saying, correct. And they actually told the residents that the water was good for you, and it turns out it causes all sorts of health problems from cancer to...
Right. So just another example of one government intervention leading to some undesired consequences, a sort of public outcry for more government intervention, and lo and behold, problems are only compounded, things only get worse. Of course, privatization is never on the table. The answer is just always more and more state emergencies. And we saw another sort of flare of this notion of adding government level upon level of regulation in order to fix previous problems caused by government. And we saw that in the State of the Union that we covered on our launch day, Sunday the 17th.
Right, that was episode 2.
And in particular, one of Obama's suggested remedies for the alleged, quote, economic anxiety that is caused by globalization, we have this proposal of wage insurance. We were both pretty incensed by this.
I think the official tweet from the Peace and Anarchy account was, wage insurance? What in the world is wage insurance?
It's truly remarkable. Of course, the concept of insurance itself is supposed to be you're covered for unpredictable events that have a very small chance of occurring, but if they did, would cause severe financial difficulty. And so as an individual who is somewhat risk-averse, you would pay a premium into an account. Of course, you're a part of a pool with other people who are also paying premiums. These premiums are then pooled, and then in the rare event of the unpredictable, uncontrollable event that some severe event occurred, you would receive a sort of windfall payout that would compensate you for your misfortune. Of course, losing a job is not exactly unpredictable. This is not something unforeseen. Of course, bad things do happen. There's no such thing as a perfect work environment or a perfect work situation. But a job is certainly not insurable.
It's also not uncontrollable. Right. It's not uncontrollable.
Exactly, yes. There are things one could do to actively affect the outcome of the working event, we would say. So we could get into this policy a little in particular.
So is Obama advocating anyone else's writings in particular?
One more time.
Is Obama recommending any particular policy advocates? Because in his speech, he was
very generic,
but I'm sure he's issued some other statements.
Yeah, he just sort of went by it really fast. I mean, I think there was just one line sort of towards the beginning of the speech, but there was plenty of follow-up. This is not a new idea. Wage insurance itself, sort of in the modern day, is from around 1980. Its current champion, as far as I can tell, is a guy by the name of Robert Lighton. He's written a book called Global Phobia, one word. We'll link to it in the show notes page. But it's essentially a text that says globalization is good, which we can agree on, right? We appreciate the general rise in the standard of living that occurs when you have an increased division of labor and a deepening of specialization amongst the working force. But he says that the globalization process can displace some American workers and cause anxieties and stresses. And so
American exceptionalism?
Yes.
Except the domestic version?
Or sort of coddling the market, right? We need to use these government policies and programs to sort of make the market transition smoother, right? We don't like the messiness of the competitive market. So the program in particular states that for individuals who have had a job, the same job, for at least 2 years, who then lose that job due to some verifiable event that has to do with globalization, such as the industry has been moved overseas, there's no similar job anymore in a certain area. The individual is responsible for demonstrating or showing some evidence of this to the particular state unemployment insurance agency, and upon acceptance into the wage insurance program, this person would then receive 50%, so long as their new wage in their new job after losing their former one had a lower wage, they would be compensated by the government. So, for example, you're working a job, you're making $50,000 a year for at least 2 years. You lose that job and you get another one that is paying less, say $40,000 a year. Well, under this program, that individual would be able to sign up to be compensated by wage insurance, and that person would earn half of the differential. So the differential being 50 less 40 is 10,000. Half of that differential would be 5,000. That person would be paid $5,000 a year until they had a new job that paid their former wage. This is, again,
Okay, so entirely arbitrary in its numbers.
Yes.
The idea that having a job for 2 years as being stable is rather ridiculous in today's climate.
Right.
And then on top of that, the $10,000 number that seems pulled out of nowhere, that it might be an average for the entire country, but that really doesn't qualify individual markets. When you look at the salaries in the Bay Area, they're entirely different from salaries, say, in Boston or Springfield, Missouri.
Sure. So really, what they're arguing is that this subsidizes the best form of worker training, right? So instead of remaining outside of the job force, now there is a new incentive to taking up a new job, even if it pays less, right? So the government is going to provide this extra benefit to people who are willing to take on lower paid work after losing their job that they've had for some time, which on its face sounds nice. But the real incentive process...
But it's not actually incentivizing new work. It's incentivizing people to take a lower paid job with less skills. There's no incentive for actual training. If I signed up for the program because I'm an engineer currently, if I lost my job and I became a burger flipper at McDonald's, that's not incentivizing me to go back to training and learn a new specialty in engineering.
Correct.
It's pretty much telling people you don't need to go out and actually work to find a new niche or a new location in the division of labor. It's encouraging people to find unskilled minimum wage jobs.
So it definitely does provide an incentive to take on lower paid work, which normally is associated with less productive work, right? Wages are a function of productivity. If you're able to produce more, you have a higher earning power. So let's say someone goes from a job that pays more to one that pays less. We know that this line of work leads to the production of a product that is demanded less relative to a product that is the outcome of a production process where wages are higher, right? And so when the government...
Well, it's specific to that individual's skills. Say if you put me in a chemistry lab, I would be paid less than your average chemist. That's not my field.
But
so it's all relative to that individual worker, and that's important to keep in mind.
But if we do look at the whole economy level, sort of in a mental experiment sort of way, wages should reflect should reflect productivity. And so those lines of work that exhibit higher wages, we can deduce from this fact that the outcome from that industry is demanded more relative to outputs of other productive processes in other industries. So what happens when the government then incentivizes people to take on lower paid work? Well, we know then that to some extent, we can't know the exact extent, but to some extent, people will start to allocate their labor in lines of work that lead to the production of some good that is less preferred than is the output from other productive processes in industries with higher wages. So what the government is doing by introducing this subsidy, this distorting incentive, is to sort of keep the market from working, right? So now wages don't adjust to new productivities and to new consumer preferences. So now goods and services that are available for purchase, they're going to be artificially more expensive. They're going to, in terms of quality, they're not going to reflect the actual preferences of the consumer. So what we see is a decline, a fall in the standard of living, And this all seems to be done in the name of protectionism. So protecting the American worker versus the Canadian worker or Mexican worker or Chinese and
worker.
like all sort of.
And on top of that, there are very few jobs that cannot be outsourced. Very few. The only one that I can really think of off the top of my head would be the truck drivers that physically move goods from one place to another. And even then, I'm sure the market will come up with a way to remove the labor aspect of that. And when you create these protectionism schemes, that's really what's harming the ability of an American worker to find an American job. So the real solution here is to remove the trade barriers and to remove anything that is harming the ability for an American to find a job, say minimum wage or laws protecting unions, so the anti-right to work legislation.
So typical consequence of government actions, it's hurting the people it's intended ostensibly to help, and the answer would be, like you just mentioned, get rid of these other problems in the labor market, like minimum wage laws, like unions, the notion of a closed shop and so forth. But we also see the negative consequences of, let's call it, government control of property in another area, and it's sort of timely given that the East Coast is being pummeled with snow right now. So maybe you want to tell us about Penguin Appreciation Day.
So January 20th is Penguin Appreciation Day. There are all sorts of funny holidays. You can Google absurd holidays and you look at tons of them because, we'd rather have our government work on stuff like that and pass these fun days as opposed to funding war. So I suppose that's a bonus.
But of course, everybody knows Penguin Day.
So Penguin,
right?
Well, I'm actually accused of being a penguin hater.
Oh, God.
But that's mostly because the documentary that came out a few years ago, March of the Penguins, I think it was narrated by Morgan Freeman. I didn't find it to be that compelling a documentary. It did not provide new information. It was really trying to apply human emotion and human stories to penguins, which from an epistemological point of view, as we learned from Mises, you can't really do that. We can guess and we can interpret what we see in animals as emotion, but we can never know for sure that they're feeling anything. And the only reason why human action can be interpreted in such a way is because we are human, and therefore we innately know how human action works. We cannot say that for any other species. But moving on from that, whenever you have sort of an animal appreciation day, it inevitably leads to calls to protect the environment, protect the penguins. And biologists have been saying that the emperor penguin, the number of penguins by the year 2100 will have decreased by 1/2 of its population today.
Wow.
And the real issue here is really one of property rights. So we have a situation going on with a tragedy of the commons, which is where you have a piece of property that is banned from ownership. And when you have that situation, you have people that have misaligned incentives. So if a piece of land is unowned, the incentive is to use up the resources as fast as possible because you don't know what the other people around you will do.
Right. The expected
Whereas
life of the
if you
source
have
is unknown.
If you have individual ownership, on the other hand, the incentive is to make it renewable. So it's to avoid capital consumption. So public ownership, you get more capital consumption than private ownership. And you see that in forestry, where logging companies generally only clean cut the land if it's federal land as opposed to their own private forests.
So in economics, this is...
And when it comes to animals...
the economics of this is the use value, right? People who own goods expect some future use value, therefore they have an incentive to maintain the usable life of the resource. Go ahead.
Right, and capital maintenance isn't a given, it's a choice. And that's one of the points that Hayek points out quite often. So when it comes to penguins, I don't know about you, but I'm not allowed to own one. And if you're not allowed to own your own penguin, what's the point? I believe you would have to have a special permit in order to house a penguin, probably only given out to zoos and biologists. And we see this happen in other animals put on the endangered species list, where the list doesn't actually do much of anything if there's no ownership involved. So we're seeing the population of tigers fall because you're not allowed to own tigers, but their use value in traditional Chinese medicine is to grind the claws or any given part in order to create some traditional remedy. It may or may not work, but people
which is all
think
that
it
matters.
works, and that's what it's important. Right, it doesn't actually have to achieve anything for it to be action. It just has to be thought that it will achieve something. So you have that. You have the African safari, so there's a huge problem with poaching there. And since you're not allowed to own the lions or the elephants, there's no incentive for the local people to maintain the herds.
Them, right?
The closest, So the closest thing to protection is that I believe it's either Kenya or Uganda that has allowed tribes to own the local herds, and in those cases you find those tribes actually protecting the animals because that's their source of income, is the tourism. But without that, there's no incentive for the local people to prevent poaching from happening. And since you have the same tragedy of the commons situation, there's more incentive for poachers to poach as many elephants as possible now, because there's no guarantee that other poachers won't come in and poach those same animals before you get there.
And I do want to mention too that a lot of this extinction hysteria is sort of unfounded. I think a lot of leftists and environmentalist people like to place the onus squarely on the human being as responsible for the mass death of all of these natural creatures, be they gods, creatures, or just given nature. And so we sort of have this equilibrium concept, this notion of a perfect, idealistic Garden of Eden that we dirty humans are corrupting, that we're destroying, and as a result, species are dying off.
Right, it's the original sin idea.
Yeah. Which is interesting because we see it in atheist circles with atheist environmentalists, and you see it also with religious people. But it despite the theological origins of the argument, it is religious. It's at least in its fervor. These people are obsessed with this notion that government needs to come in and punish the dirty, vile human being, setting aside the fact that people in government are people too. But somebody needs to punish.
We need a government made of bad people
Exactly.
to control
so
people.
Somebody needs to punish these dirty human beings who are corrupting this otherwise pristine environment. And these people forget the fact that nature is a killer. I mean, floods, tornadoes, ice ages, tsunamis, earthquakes, you name it.
Well, and just the food chain
Right.
itself. Lions have no incentive to protect the gazelle population necessarily.
Right.
That's their food source.
So it really is anti-human. I mean, trying to impede people for the sake of it to preserve this fantastical, mythical notion of the pristine wonder that is nature. I mean, it's just arbitrary.
Well, and then on top of that, we have a known solution, which is private property. So we do have a fantastic example of an endangered species actually rebounding and is no longer on the list, and that is the American bison. So the American bison were mostly wiped out by the U.S. government in a starvation campaign against the Native American tribes. So first off, you have bad government action there. And then on top of it, for many years, it was illegal to own bison, even though they're highly valued for their meat and for their fur and for other items, right? You can use pretty much every part of a bison for something. And eventually, there were some legislative changes, and it's now legal to own bison. And we have plenty of herds privately owned. And as a result, since there's still that use value, so we have herds of bison for fiber collection to make yarn. I've actually used bison yarn before. It's incredibly soft and you can't felt it, so it's really durable. You see, in most grocery stores nowadays, you can buy bison meat. You don't have to go to a specialty store. It's right there in Safeway.
Yeah, and so to really encap.
So because you have that use value, you have an incentive to maintain your herd, and the bison has been removed from the endangered species list altogether.
Yeah, it really. In fact, just along those lines, I was going to sum it up. It says we have here a Mises.org article that we'll link to. From 1884 to 1902, the bison population in Yellowstone actually decreased from 25 to 23, but also by 1902, an estimated 700 were privately owned. This trend has continued for more than a century, as by the 1990s, the ratio was 25,000 publicly owned to 250,000 privately owned bison. So now there's something of a flourishing bison market, and everybody's better off for it, including the bison, who are now more numerous than they otherwise would have been.
Exactly.
So sort of to segue into our next topic here, I've been, speaking of Mises.org, in fact, I've been listening to a 10-part series conducted by Paul Cantor, a PhD in literature from Harvard. Very good, self-taught Austrian economist, but also a literary critic. He has a book called Literature and the Economics of Liberty. It's a compendium co-edited with Stephen Cox. And in the first chapter, we have sort of Paul Cantor's main exposition, his sort of driving thesis. He talks about Marxism and collectivism in literary criticism. He discusses a sort of perfectionism that a lot of literary critics exhibit. They want to see a novel or a work of art in which all of the details are nice and conformed. They all lead one to the next and tell a beautiful story. It's all sort of perfectly put together. We can think of this as sort of the perfect equilibrium notion of ideal poetry or ideal art or literature. And then, of course, opposite that is the deconstructionist school. Both the deconstructionist and the new critic school were 19th century literary schools of criticism. And the deconstructionists wanted to obliterate meaning in a text, even find meaning in words that even the author didn't understand. anyway, why do we bring this up? Well, we see a sort of inherent antagonism or reluctance to accept the role of commerce, the role of markets in art. We have a sort of idealistic notion of the artist locked away in his room, secure and shielded from the vicious, messy markets and from the...
Right, it's an idealized Emily Dickinson, who was famous for being a shut-in, and, in fact, I don't think left her home for many decades. She, of course, never became famous in her lifetime.
Right. And that's really become the narrative in all lines of artistic criticism or in thinking about art, is that in order to be successful, the artist must be shielded from the marketplace and from consumers and their changing preferences and tastes, which for some people...
Right. Well, we know consumers always make the wrong decision.
Well, he does leave room for the individual genius, the Michelangelos, the Shakespeares, people who truly do have an artistic genius. He, given that he's an Austrian economist, he recognizes the importance of the creative mind of the individual in the whole production process, be it artistic or otherwise. And so it's not as if art can't take place in isolation. Many times it does, but he highlights the role of the market, and his main example is
Well, the market is what gives it purpose. The market is what gives it purpose. You can have a Shakespeare in isolation, but there's no point if no one else reads it. Right.
Again, we're getting back to incentives here, and he does mention Shakespeare in particular in his lecture series on Mises.org, that he is maybe one of the greatest commercial artistic minds ever. Of course, the Globe Theater was a commercial operation. His actors were paid. It was a business enterprise, right? He was not shielded from the market. And Cantor makes the argument that this process of feedback from consumers, namely when people choose to buy or not, it shapes the final product of the artist, and many times for the better. I was about to mention the serialization of the novel in the 1900s, where a novel would be written piecewise in some magazine, and then once it was finished, chapter by chapter in monthly or weekly installations, it would then be compiled and published as its own work. And what Cantor finds...
Right, so those are some famous examples, just to give our audience, of the serialized novel, are pretty much all the Charles Dickens novels. So A Tale of Two Cities was serialized. Oliver Twist was serialized.
And he mentions that in these serializations, artists, namely the author, would, given that this process is occurring over time, would have some errors. There would be lapses in small details. For example, he talks about the book Wives and Daughters, thought to be... the highlight of this woman, Elizabeth Glasgow's literary career. She serialized this novel from 1864 to 66 in a magazine called the Cornhill Magazine. And there were some discrepancies about when certain characters would blush or if they wouldn't blush. And it turned out that this particular author died before the book was completed. And it was eventually published without an ending. And it is still thought of as her best work, despite the fact that it doesn't have that ending, because it was so good, because it had absorbed the sort of loose, imperfect nature of the serialization process. The result wasn't perfect, right? It wasn't what the new critic would want to see. It wasn't...
Right, and I think a great analog to today's society would be television shows. You can look at shows like Breaking Bad. If you watch the first seasons, it's pretty much universally agreed that the later seasons are vastly improved over the early seasons. And a lot of that is because the writers shifted directions at several points. So at the beginning, you were supposed to sympathize with the Walter White character. And then about halfway through the first season, the writers realized that, hey, the audience really isn't sympathizing with this guy. They're actually sympathizing with the sidekick character. So they adjusted the script accordingly.
Well, I don't know. Paul Cantor might disagree. I met him once, and I've seen him speak about this in particular. Breaking Bad is one of his favorite series of all time. If I can put words in his mouth, I think that's accurate. He loves
I've
Walter
heard that
White, and sort of views him as a tragic hero that the audience does support throughout the entire show. He's got we'll have to link to it. He has an interview with Tom Woods on the Tom Woods Show where he discusses this. But yeah, I mean, what's all of this got to do with peace and anarchy, the individual? Well, I mean, I think it's important that we look at art with the same individualist mindset we would look at political philosophy or economics, because these lessons, these stories, are the way that we interpret art affects our own understanding of the place of the individual, the role of liberty, the body of libertarian political philosophy. So I think,
as well as the spreading of ideas. That all happens
right.
in the marketplace.
And you mentioned television. We have another great example of an artist who is producing a product in a market environment, but particularly in the field of liberty. And this is the Voluntarist series that is put together by Jamie Rook Sherman. The website is volcomic.com, volcomic.com. We'll link to it in the show notes. But what Jamie's done is put together a superhero-based comic book that incorporates ideas of liberty. And so it follows the voluntary... Isn't it awesome?
Fantastic.
It follows the voluntarist superheroes. Like I said, there's been 4 installations. The most recent is the voluntarist versus the NSA, Saving Snowden. The first installation, and that one just came out. The first installation was the original voluntarist, and then he has one, the voluntarist versus status zombies, and the voluntarist versus the TSA. So really great stuff, very nice illustrations, and a very simple, and I don't mean simple as in an intellectually shallow, I mean simple as in a digestible and intelligible plot and script. So very nice to follow, a nice gift for somebody maybe younger who is interested in this sort of thing. I mean, they're only $5 for the hard copy, $1.99 for the digital copy. So another great example of the market sort of bringing about a thriving, or at least a budding, culture.
Right, and I think one of the great things about the comic book in particular is that he doesn't necessarily hit you over the head with a John Galt's 30-page exposition. It's very much written in the manner that you're interpreting it for yourself, which I think appeals to a broader
audience. It's very
audience.
young. It's funny. There's actually some lines in there that are pretty funny, especially in the zombie one.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and the other great thing about it is that I lost my train of thought there. He has great artwork for one, and two, it's opening it up to a new audience. Right. I mean, the Comic-Con audience isn't necessarily one that directly correlates with libertarianism. When you look at superheroes in general, they have no regard for private property, and I'm sure the voluntarist does, which is a great thing to point out.
They're defensive superheroes.
When you watch superhero movies, right? When you watch superhero movies, you see all the time just like cities getting destroyed in the wake of getting rid of the one enemy. And I don't know about the rest of our audience, but I know sometimes I've thought like, oh my, look at the cleanup.
Exactly.
So it's great that the voluntarist brings out this other side of superheroes, which is really the voluntary private sector.
And that's true. I mean, this is a method of reaching new people, which of course is wonderful, but I think it's also good for people that are already in the movement. You know, it's nice to experience the ideas from a different angle or a different medium. And I think this is, a lot of people like to criticize the libertarian brand. It's boring, it has no culture, it's not sexy, there's no vibrancy and this sort of thing. Well, this is the kind of thing this is
all
the kind of thing that
unfounded.
adds that level of flair, that makes things interesting and different and exciting and fun. So good on Jamie. Really support him. Hope to see more of the voluntarists in the future. But to close out, maybe you can tell us about how Boston and Baltimore residents like to homestead parking spots in a blizzard.
Right, so as I'm sure most of the country is aware of, the East Coast got blasted with a blizzard. I think the official name for it from the Washington Post was the Snowzilla. So I think Baltimore got their record snowfall from an individual storm, which was 29.2 inches. And inevitably what happens is that you have a shortage of parking spaces after an event. So you already have a scarcity of parking spots without snowfall. But then when you add the snowfall on top of that, you have an additional scarcity problem.
So these are parking spots
And
specifically on public streets. Mm-hmm.
Public streets, these are not in parking lots or parking garages. These
Okay,
are
so
on
the
the
supply-
public roadway. And typically they're
Right, so the
regulated
supply
by
is
local
already pretty
government.
much fixed, right? There is no market for on-street parking.
Right. No, the closest thing to a market is in some of these places you have to buy local resident permits in order to park there for more than a given number of hours. So in local Baltimore parking, you're limited to 2 hours at a time if you don't have the number 12 for
Right.
Charles
So
Village
on
sticker.
top of the fact that there's no functioning market, there's also price
So
fixing.
on top of, yeah. Right, there's already a shortage, and then on top of that, when you throw in a blizzard, you have even more of a shortage because the snow has taken up these spots. And there's somewhat of a tradition in these places. If you shovel out your spot, it's yours. And so there's this notion of the parking chair, which I think it's officially named the Pittsburgh parking chair, but it's been found in many cities across the East Coast. And if you clean off your spot and you put a lawn chair, a traffic cone, or I've heard of some cases even an ironing board out in your spot, you've effectively staked it out as yours. You cleaned out the spot, you mixed your labor with the space, we'll say, in order to create a usable object, which is a parking spot. And so the idea is that you have that spot to some reasonable degree until the snow clears, until the relative scarcity has been alleviated. And it's interesting to note that the local governments absolutely despise this. In all of the cities where this is a tradition, except for Boston, it's flat out illegal. And the cities always, whenever there's a blizzard, come out and say, you know, this parking chair thing, it's got to go. We don't like it. Not cool. And they'll threaten to go by and pick up everyone's chairs. And you even get private citizens that get rather judgy about the whole thing. And there's a Craigslist ad posted in Baltimore that was, hey, look, free lawn chairs.
Right.
You know, come pick them up. And it was a guy trying to clear off parking on his street without going through the shoveling snow aspect of it that
typical
everyone
special
else did.
interest
So
seeker.
the laws are very anti-property in this case.
There's these see something, say something, busybody people who they don't want to go shovel the snow for themselves, so they go kowtowing or begging the government to come in and enforce their preferences the way they ought to see it.
Right, and one of the really interesting things about this whole thing is it really illustrates how important scarcity is to the notion of property. Because once the snow melts, that relative scarcity is gone, and the notion of sticking a parking chair in a parking spot is rather absurd. But once there's snow and you have that scarcity problem, then people understand.
It's really a nice exposition of the role of scarcity in economics. I mean, in the time immediately after or even during a blizzard, the parking space supply is zero. Right? There are no parking spaces. There may be some roads, but the parking spaces are themselves pummeled with snow. And so, just like you said, what individuals are doing is homesteading natural, unowned resources, right? They're clearing the way, as it were.
Right. It's a very clear illustration of Lockean property theory, where you have people mixing their labor with some sort of natural phenomenon. In this case, they're getting rid of snow, but it's the same
And
concept.
then as the conditions change and the snow goes away, the supply then ought to increase. And of course, in a functioning market where people transacted and exchanged and engaged in voluntary interactions in order to allocate parking spots to those who most urgently need them. Rather than this, we have a system of sort of fixed supply of on-street parking that is regulated, and then we have price controls on top of it. And, of course, the parking situation in Boston is awful to begin with. So the fact that all of this is compounded.
It's awful everywhere. So, well, on that note, we'd like to sign off. And so we'd like to remind everyone to subscribe to our show in iTunes and Stitcher. And our shows are now up on YouTube as well. And do you have anything else you'd like to add, Ryan?
It's been a great show. You know, we want to privatize water rights. We want to eliminate labor market subsidies and regulations. We want full private property and penguin ownership. Art benefits directly from market interactions and commerce, and of course, there's always a role for homesteading in blizzards in Boston. So we hope you enjoyed the topics covered today. We'll be back next week. I think it's the last Sunday in January for episode 5. Like Tabor mentioned, we're on iTunes and Stitcher. SoundCloud is to come. YouTube takes a bit longer to get the videos up, but during the week it'll be available for you to stream there as well. Of course, you can always come to our website at peaceanarchy.com. Facebook is facebook.com/Peace Anarchy Podcast. We're on Twitter at Voice of Rothbard. And at our website, you can leave us topic suggestions and criticism. We'd love to hear it from you.
Absolutely. Please contact us. We love to
Okay,
hear your
folks,
comments.
that's episode 4. Bye for now.